I'm Emily Chang in Washington, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Facebook's fake news fight. How the social media platform continues to tackle this issue. But can they win? And what does it mean for upcoming elections around the globe? Plus, tech giants like Facebook, Alphabet, and Apple facing new pressure from Washington. What's in store for tech regulation? We'll talk with Congressman Greg Walden. And tech leaders are congregating in Paris this week. We'll hear from some of the top names in European tech, including the heads of Deliveroo and Atomico, who are both attending the tech summit hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron. But first, to our top story. Facebook launching an aggressive new campaign to tell the world how it's fighting fake news and how its 2 billion users can spot it. The social network has also been hiring new employees by the thousands and touting AI as a weapon to flag offending content. We caught up with Facebook's chief AI scientist at Bloomberg Sooner Than You Think Summit in Paris, who talked about how.
AI produces the bad content, but AI also has part of the solution of detecting when something is bad. And then people also kind of adapt. You know, we kind of quickly learn to kind of deal with information that's not entirely reliable.
Here now with more, we are joined by Tessa Lyons, Facebook Newsfeed Product Manager from Stanford, California, to talk about what else Facebook is doing to fight this fight. So Tessa, you guys are launching a massive new initiative today, basically a sort of fake news literacy campaign, and you have personally been on the front lines of this. So I'd love it if you could start by giving us an idea of the scale of the fake news problem and how that has changed over the last couple of years, especially from your point of view.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for having me. We've been working hard to stop the spread of false news. And given the scale, as you mentioned, we've been using both technology and human review. And I'd love to talk with you more about those actions. What we're sharing today are updates on our efforts to communicate more openly about our actions and to be held accountable for the progress that we're making. So specifically, we're sharing a short film that gives an inside look at the teams fighting false news on Facebook, the work that we do to disrupt financial incentives, to fight fake accounts, and to reduce the overall spread of this type of content. And we're also sharing that we're going to be working with academics in order to provide them with data to help all of us better understand and measure the volume and effects of misinformation and the impact of our efforts to fight it.
You're launching a new short film called Facing Facts, which profiles you and other people at Facebook who are working on this. This is in addition to a TV ad campaign, a print ad campaign. What about the people out there who say this is just PR spin?
Well, what I would say is that we're all deeply committed to fighting false news on Facebook. We recognize that there's a fake news problem, and we recognize that it's not what people want when they come to Facebook. So we're committed, based on the feedback from our community, to actually improve this problem. In order to be held accountable, we need to do more to help academics access the data so that we can all measure the current volume and effects of misinformation and the trends in those over time so that we can prove that our efforts are actually having an effect and helping us to fight this problem and to contain the spread of false news on Facebook.
So we talk a lot about fake news, but this sort of fully bogus fake stuff isn't necessarily the biggest problem. Actually, a bigger concern might be sort of hyper-partisan news that presents facts in a sort of misleading way and with a political agenda. What are you doing about that?
You're absolutely right that when we say misinformation or fake news, we're all referring to a lot of different problems. And so it's important for us to break them down in order to fight them most effectively. We've actually seen that the majority of false news on Facebook is financially motivated. And so one of the main things that we're doing is working to disrupt those financial incentives. Now, that might look like truly fake facts, but that can also look like partisan or misleading content. By going after those financial incentives, we can reduce the spread of a broad swath of that content. But more broadly, we know there's also information that people are sharing that might not be financially motivated, but might be fake or misleading in other ways. And so one of the things that we're doing is working with fact checkers in order to provide people with more context about the stories that they're seeing, and in some cases to reduce the spread of those stories by showing them lower in people's newsfeed.
So fact checkers are one thing. Others have suggested, why doesn't Facebook just hire its own journalists? And it's an idea that Facebook has been sort of allergic to. But why not hire your own journalists who could make some of these decisions?
Emily, we have 2 billion people around the world using Facebook in order to connect with friends, family, and the things that they care about. What we're committed to doing is ensuring that when people come to Facebook, they have the experience that they expect, that it's authentic, that it's high quality, and that it's credible information. In order to best do that, we need a variety of tools. We need to remove fake accounts. In the first quarter of this year alone, we removed 583 million fake accounts who are often involved in seeding and spreading misinformation and other types of low-quality content. We also need to go after the financial incentives. Third, we need to reduce the spread of false or misleading content by showing those stories lower in newsfeed. And then fourth, we need to give people more information. Across the board, we need to use both technology and human review. But the problem isn't so much about the individuals who are providing or weighing in on some of this content. It's really how we can scale this effort in order to go after the full breadth of this challenge and fight it most effectively around the world.
And once a piece of news or fake news is flagged, fact-checked, put out, what do you do to make sure it doesn't get recycled in other ways and appear elsewhere?
It's a great question. So to use one example, if we have an article that has been rated as false by one of the fact checkers that we partner with, we reduce the spread of that individual article in newsfeed. But we also use machine learning in order to identify duplicates of those articles or ways in which that same content might be reappearing from other domains or from other pages. Because we know that in many cases, the bad actors behind this content aren't just sharing one example of it, they're trying to create duplicates in order to further achieve their financial incentives or whatever their objectives might be. And I think what's really important about this point is that we have to recognize that the fight against fake news is an adversarial fight, that there are people who are highly motivated, whether those motivations are financial or otherwise, to continue to spread this type of information and to profit from it in whatever way that might be. So we need to ensure that our systems are staying ahead of their adaptations and anticipating the next wave of this fight.
So on that note, obviously, Russia's efforts to undermine American democracy using Facebook are continuing. Is it actually possible to stop this problem, to stop disinformation on Facebook? Or is it a losing battle?
It's possible, absolutely, for us to do a much better job of ensuring that the information that people see on Facebook is authentic and high quality. Now, the broader conversation around misleading information is something that's been around long before social media and will continue to be a challenge. So we need to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to give people information so that they can also make informed decisions, which is why one of the things that we're sharing today is a broader effort that we have to help people identify potentially false or misleading information by giving them tips for trends that they can spot. And this is part of a broader effort we have to be more transparent with people about the information that they're seeing on Facebook, the people behind that information, and the steps that they can take to control the information that they see in their own personal newsfeed.
Now, there are reports that engagement is down across the board on Facebook as a result of the changes you've been making to newsfeed. And of the top couple dozen news sites or so, all of them are seeing decreased engagement. Is that the case?
Well, I want to take one step back and just say that Mark was really clear earlier this year that our fight to protect Facebook is a top priority, and that at times that will come requiring trade-offs in other parts of our business, whether that's trade-offs of people who are focused on the integrity problems or investments that we need to make. But regardless of those trade-offs, we're committed. Now, to your question about the trends that we're seeing, we've announced a number of changes about newsfeed over the course of the last several months, and one of those changes was that we are reprioritizing friends and family content coming first. That has caused pages across the political spectrum of news, of other varieties, to see changes to their own traffic. But what we're remaining committed to is ensuring that the public content people do see is authentic, high quality, and informative. And so we've announced a number of changes to both reduce the spread of bad content like clickbait and sensationalism and false news, and also promote broadly trusted sources. But this is going to be an ongoing effort, and we'll continue to have more to share as we improve our efforts.
Now, Facebook is still trying to figure out how news publishers fit into this whole transparency initiatives. And initially, the plan was to have, political ads on other news sites be put into this public database that would then need to be verified, essentially. But there was a lot of criticism of this, and now Facebook is rethinking this plan. Any progress towards a clear solution?
I think what this reflects is that across the board, we're trying to take steps to be more transparent with people and to give them more information. We're also working closely with governments around the world and with other civil society stakeholders in order to understand how best to do that. We're going to continue to learn and to evolve and to ensure that at the end of the day, we remain committed to giving people that open, transparent information and the controls that need to come with it.
Mark Zuckerberg testified before EU lawmakers yesterday, and, some came away feeling like he did not answer their questions. What do you think, Mark Zuckerberg, the leader of your company, does he have a greater responsibility to give more straight answers and answer the questions that people seem to continue to have?
We all have a responsibility, Mark and all of us who work on these problems, to be more open and transparent with people and to answer their questions directly. We've made a lot of progress in doing so, but we certainly have more work to do. And if there's places where we're falling down, I expect that people will hold us accountable, and we want to be held accountable for being more open and honest about those answers.
Tessa Lyons, Facebook Newsfeed Product Manager, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Emily.
Coming up, French President Macron hosts dozens of tech leaders in Paris. We'll hear from Will Shu, CEO of Deliveroo, who attended. This is Bloomberg. IBM has just announced it's hiring 1,400 employees in France over the next 2 years. The new positions will focus on AI, blockchain, and cybersecurity. Europe has become a draw for tech companies big and small. Deliveroo is one of Europe's biggest startups. Deliveroo CEO Will Shu spoke to Bloomberg during the Sooner Than You Think summit in Paris and talked about growth.
It was a great place to start a business. We're in 12 countries, Western Europe, Southern Europe, UAE, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And the UK was a great place to start up a business, able to convince people to work in a dark room without heating in the beginning, and people were willing to take a risk on that. We found it pretty straightforward to launch in other European countries as well. France is our second biggest market, and we've had a lot of success here recruiting a great team.
Your second biggest market is where we're stood now, and you're about to go meet the president of France, Macron. What will you be talking to him about?
Well, I think that our interactions with the French government have been very positive. He has been pro-business, pro-growth, pro-investment, and just looking forward to hearing from him.
A lot of it is about tech for good. How do you ensure that Deliveroo is scaling with the ethics that you want?
Yeah, look, we today announced a free insurance product for all of our riders around the world, which covers them in the event of injury, also protects them, protects their income in the event of injury as well. So we're doing a lot of things along that front.
Regulation has obviously been focused upon the driver and on the flexibility, meeting protection. Is that a square you can circle to a certain extent? You're helping by giving them insurance,
Definitely.
But do they need more in terms of, pay and ensuring they get the minimum wage?
So the number one reason why Deliveroo riders work with us overwhelmingly is flexibility. So the ability to log in and out, the ability to work whenever you want. And at the same time, I personally believe we need to offer benefits as well. There has been this sort of impasse between flexibility and benefits, and so we want to work with governments, including the French government, to end this.
What about scaling as you continue to? You're going into new ventures, new ideas, you're helping fund new concepts at restaurants. What are some of the new innovations you're coming up with to stay ahead of the competition, such as Uber Eats? And you're going to be sat next to Dara Khosrowshahi potentially at today's meeting.
Yeah, look, for us, we're all about food. So it's about going deeper and deeper into the food chain. So we've created hundreds of delivery-only kitchens to help our restaurant partners expand. We're helping our restaurants build virtual brands that only exist on Deliveroo. We're helping funding new concepts as well. And this is just the beginning, so we're really excited about that.
Just the beginning, geographically speaking as well. You're in 12 countries. How many more will we see you go into?
We're in expansion mode, not just for new markets, but actually going deeper into current markets as well. At the end of June, we'll be in over 150 cities in France, and we're continuing to expand into new cities every single day all across the world.
What about the future of Deliveroo? You've just been giving equity to those that work with you.
Yeah.
You clearly, at some point, want to have a liquidity event to help satisfy those workers. Will you IPO? Will you sell? What's the vision?
It's not on my mind. I'm just focused on the opportunity. For us, we are so early in what we want to accomplish that an exit event is just not even remotely on my radar.
That was Will Shu, Deliveroo CEO, speaking with our very own Caroline Hyde. Coming up, the European Union is about to set the standard for protecting user data. Our conversation with the EU ambassador to the United States, David O'Sullivan. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. As we've discussed, French President Emmanuel Macron has been on a drive to boost investment in France and meeting with some of the biggest names in technology, including Mark Zuckerberg and Satya Nadella. Atomico CEO Nicholas Zenstrom is also attending. Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde spoke with Zenstrom at the Sooner Than You Think event and talked about what he expects to come out of it.
I think it's great that President Macron is engaging with technology to start with, because we all need that, but also to addressing the aspect that technology can have positive impact, and also, of course, that it can have negative impacts that we need to deal with as well.
Talk to us about the ramifications and the responsibilities of technology, because Mark Zuckerberg is going to be at this particular event, and he's a man who's had to deal with a lot of the repercussions of getting too big too quick, potentially.
Yeah, sure. So if you take a bit of a historical perspective, technology, since it started with the Industrial Revolution, has created a lot of growth and economical growth and prosperity. It also has had a lot of negative impacts, environment, and so forth. And my belief is that the new generation of technology, so the digital technology and high tech, has a lot of positive impacts in terms of climate change, water, and so forth. However, it's also now this technology is starting to have some unplanned consequences as well that we all need to deal with, whether that is privacy, whether that is algorithms that has biases, and these are things that everyone else in the technology world have to take responsibility for this now.
So when you're funding new startups, as you do with Atomico, how are you having those conversations with founders to ensure that the culture and the ethics grow in the right way?
Yeah. It's really interesting to see that younger founders are starting their companies. Of course, they're watching what's happening, and they're sponges, and they're seeing, okay, what can we learn from the previous generation of entrepreneurs? So they want to build these things into their companies from day one. So when we're investing in them, we're coming in with talking to them about governance, but we're also asking them the questions about diversity, about ethics, and this is something that all of them are responding very well to. So I think there's an opportunity to work with the next generation of founders to build in some kind of code of conduct from the day one.
What about the next generation of European founders versus American founders? Is this a coming of age? We've just seen Spotify list for 20 billion. You've got money. You've got iZettle being bought by PayPal. You've got money coming back into the ecosystem. Are we at a turning point?
Yeah. So I would say it's an inflection point. It's not a turning point. It's an inflection point. We have been at a steady growth since the years after 2000, and when we had the Skype exit in 2005, that was a big thing. But now this IPO of Spotify is 10x, and along the way we had $60 billion companies in the last 10 years. You had 14 $5 billion companies. You had a few 10 or $25 billion companies, Spotify, Arm. So the scale is getting bigger and bigger. So there is no doubt in my mind that Europe is now at that inflection point of continuous growth.
we've had different types of exits. iZettle was meant to be coming to the market to list, and suddenly it gets swooped up and snapped up by PayPal. Meanwhile, Spotify did indeed list. Do you wish you'd listed Skype? Was it a possibility?
So the first time, so when we started Skype in 2002, we said we're going to build a company for a really long term. If this company is going to be around and be a meaningful player in 15 years, we're going to be happy. So 15 years down the road, it's still around and is doing fine. So that's what we're happy with. So we never had the intention to sell. But you also have to look at what are the alternatives. So back then, there was really no prospect of listing, and so that was the right thing to do. However, now when we are speaking to our founders or companies we're looking at investing in, we want them to have a listing as a long-term goalpost, and because we want them to build independent companies instead of building something that you're selling. And we like to say that great companies may be acquired and bad companies get sold. So if you just focus on building a long-term company, that is the right way to do it. I'm
going to pick you up on Skype doing fine. Could it be doing better?
Listen, I don't know. I'm not following it so much. Of course, it can always do better. I mean, it probably has fewer users than WhatsApp, so yes, it could do better. But what is very rewarding for me as I travel around the world. Yeah. I still have a lot of people thanking me that they're using Skype to connect with their families, and that is rewarding enough for me.
And what about where they list? We were just talking about every company should aim to go public. Europe or the US?
Yeah. So I don't know if it matters that much. I would like to think that the stock market is becoming a global market. It's not really that yet. However, I would say that if you're kind of building your company, I'm thinking very much about how are we building this ecosystem, whether it's in Europe or in other locations. So you need a lot of things to happen. You need to have really good talent coming from the top universities that we have, and then you need to have also capital. And so take, for example, here in Europe and in the Nordics and all over Europe, we have fantastic institutions which are long-term investors, pension funds. If they can get access to these tech companies, then that's going to be very positive for the ecosystem, because then the value that's been created are coming back to the pension holders and the whole European economy. So in that way, I would love these companies to list locally, of course. And I think it's a choice. And the stock markets here in Europe are very welcoming to tech companies. As a matter of fact, over the last year, 4 out of the 10 biggest tech IPOs were in Europe.
Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde there with Niklas Zennström, CEO of Atomico at Bloomberg Tech Sooner Than You Think event in Paris. Coming up, our conversation with the EU ambassador to the United States, David O'Sullivan, about GDPR and the future of global trade. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in Washington. On Friday, Europe's new data privacy laws will go into effect. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, could bring in unprecedented fines for companies that fail to adequately protect the data of EU citizens. We're talking 4% of an offending entity's total global revenue, or $24 million, whichever is judged to be higher. This on the back of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before EU lawmakers, where some legislators felt they didn't get the answers they were hoping for.
Will you allow users to escape targeted advertising? I mean, I asked you 6 yes and no questions. I got not a single answer. Yeah. And of course, well, you asked for this format, well, for a reason.
Okay. I'll make sure we follow up and get you answers to those.
To discuss this and much more involving the European Union, I want to welcome EU Ambassador to the United States, David O'Sullivan, joining me here in the studio. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So what do you make of the criticism that, Zuckerberg didn't answer all the questions and said he would get back to them about a lot of the questions, which we still don't know if we're going to get those answers.
Well, I think it was very good that he went. It was very good that he agreed to speak before the European Parliament. And it was good that he heard at first hand some of the strong feelings there are amongst European politicians about these issues around privacy and around use of data. The question of the format was something decided by the Parliament. I think it probably would have been impossible to answer all those questions in the time allotted. I think this is part of an ongoing dialogue. We're having other contacts with Facebook. I think they know that there are issues, and these are complicated issues. So I think this was a good first step in opening a dialogue, and I'm sure there will be more.
One of the questions was, convince me you're not a monopoly and why we shouldn't break up Facebook. And he talked about how Facebook faces stiff competition, and yet this is a company with 2 billion users that owns 3 of the other major social networks, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp. What could the EU conceivably do to address the monopoly question?
Well,
and
I think it's very important
to
understand that EU anti-monopoly law is not run on a political basis. It's not run by the European Parliament or even by the member states. It's run by the European Commission on the basis of well-established rules about dominant position and so forth. So I think the issue of abuse of dominant position or monopoly inquiries under the antitrust laws are a matter for the European Commission to conduct in the usual way. So I don't think this is something which enters into the political domain.
And they've been quite aggressive when talking about companies like Google in particular. Do you think they could take a greater interest in Facebook?
I have no idea, because it depends on what the facts would say. I mean, anti-monopoly and antitrust legislation and action is based on objective facts. It's based on analysis. So I think this is not something that's just going to be driven by political concerns. And the cases you've referred to have been the result of long investigations and in a very transparent and open way. So I have great faith in the objectivity of our antitrust activities.
We're just days away from GDPR going into effect. How will we really know if Facebook is complying and other companies?
Well, the answer is that the rules are there. It would be eventually for people who feel that their data is not being properly protected to make a complaint, or for someone to introduce a complaint to one of the data protection authorities. Then there would have to be an examination. The company would be given the opportunity to respond. And, if I may say so, Emily, you talked about these fines. This would be a fine will be the instrument of last resort at the end of a process in which companies have been asked to explain whether they're compliant, whether they're not compliant, why they're not compliant. So I don't think there's any risk that companies are going to find themselves suddenly out of the blue subject to heavy fines without there being due process and the time given to respond to any concerns there may be.
So on this note, you've made the argument that companies could actually be more innovative as a result of GDPR, but there's also small businesses that have said they've been put out of business as a result of this. Does that concern you?
I'm not aware of anyone who's been put out of business. Let's be clear, the GDPR, which enters into force on Friday, is not substantially different from the privacy directive we've had in 1995. It does introduce some new procedures, and it does introduce the element of enforcement through fines. But we've had a 2-year period for people to get used to this and to prepare. So, frankly, I think there is perhaps a little too much hype about the possible impact of this. It's evolution rather than revolution, and I believe that most companies have been able to adapt and prepare for this in an orderly way.
Do you think the U.S. will or should enact similar legislation?
That's for the U.S. to decide. I note that nearly 120 countries around the world have overarching data privacy rules based on the same principles as the GDPR, which in fact were based on OECD principles established 20 years ago. It's for the U.S. to decide whether they want to go down that road. They are a little bit the exception today.
And with ongoing elections in Europe, we've been talking about the primaries here in the United States. Are you satisfied with what Facebook's done so far to clean up its act when it comes to election meddling?
Well, that's not for me to judge. I mean, I understand that, as Mr. Zuckerberg said yesterday, they have already taken some action in the area of election activity. But this is an ongoing debate. I think it's a complex debate, and I think it's going to take more time to figure out how the potential abuse of social media platforms in attempts to influence elections or other plebiscite results, it needs to be countered in the most transparent and effective way possible.
Now, we have to talk about trade, and the EU's exclusion from the steel and aluminum tariffs expires June 1st. Where do talks stand?
Well, we are still in conversations. Cecilia Malmström, the European Union Trade Commissioner, is in regular contact with Secretary Ross. Our position is that we do not believe that European exports of steel and aluminium pose any threat to American national security or even to the American economy. We're the second largest exporter by volume and the largest exporter by value. In many cases, we export very specialized products which can't even be obtained here in the United States. And these are inputs to American companies producing products frequently then used by the auto industry or other companies. So we think our exports are good for America. We don't see why they should be subject to tariffs. We don't see why they should be subject to any volume restriction. And that's our position. We wait to see what the president's decision finally will be. And in the same context, we have said that we are willing to discuss other trade issues that the U.S. may wish to put on the table, such as industrial tariffs, but only once we have settled this issue of the exemption, a permanent exemption for steel and aluminium.
How optimistic are you that you will get that permanent exemption?
I honestly don't know. We've made our case. We believe it's a good case, but we understand that there are pressures going in other directions, and we will wait to see what the president and the administration decide.
Would you tolerate quotas, and if so, at what level?
We have said that we would be willing to see what would happen if there were to be a tariff rate quota set at 100% of existing trade. So in other words, no diminution of our exports. We would be willing to see how that might impact on our exports and reserve our rights under the WTO. But our basic preference is for a permanent and full exemption, because we really do not think there is a case to be made that these exports in any way damage America's national interest.
If you don't get that exemption on June 1st, what will you do?
If tariffs are imposed, we fully reserve our rights under the WTO to impose rebalancing tariffs on equivalent amounts of American exports, and we've already started the procedures in the WTO to make this possible if we get to that point, which is not where we want to be, and it's not the outcome that we wish for.
On Iran, realistically, is there a way to salvage the accord that the U.S. has pulled the plug on?
Yes, I think we have said very clearly, as have the other parties to the agreement, that as long as Iran maintains its part of the bargain and continues to respect the agreement, we will do everything we can to keep this agreement in place. It is an agreement which is not just agreed by the European Union, by 3 of our member states, and by Russia and China, but by the international community. It has been approved by a resolution of the UN Security Council. So this is actually a global agreement, not just something involving the United States and Iran. We deeply regret that the United States has taken the decision it has, but we are fully committed to implementing this agreement as long as Iran meets its side of the bargain.
That said, despite these reassurances, there is some skepticism that European countries would actually risk the ire of the United States as a result of this.
European companies, you mean? Countries.
Mm-hmm.
Our countries, I think, are very clear. I think the question would be more accurate if you said that European companies who do business in the United States may feel they have to face a choice between doing business with Iran or doing business with the U.S., and that commercial choice will be made in due course by those companies. But there are many companies in Europe that don't do a lot of business in the United States. And by the way, we should not forget that there are Chinese and Indian and Russian companies who will step in. So one of the consequences of this could indeed be that some of the vacuum is taken by competitors of the United States and of Europe who could benefit from this decision.
We're, potentially on the brink of a trade war with China. What would you like to see the United States do here?
Well, I think that the United States is perfectly entitled to put on the table with its trading partners, whether that is China, whether that is Europe, or in the context of NAFTA, concerns that they have. I think the key issue, however, has to be that for any discussions of this kind to be successful, you need to look for win-win outcomes. You need outcomes where everyone feels they come away with some additional benefit. And that is what I think we need to pursue in addressing any of these concerns, whether that's in dealing with China, whether that's dealing with between the United States and Europe. We also have many concerns with China. We share many of the administration's concerns with China, particularly on the conditions for doing business in China, conditions for investing in China, compulsory acquisition of intellectual property and so forth. And we would be happy to work with this administration and with China to see if we can find solutions to those structural problems, which are by far the most pressing for our industry.
All right. David O'Sullivan, EU Ambassador to the United States, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, HPE reports its second quarter, and the numbers looked positive. But why did they get such a bad reception on Wall Street? We will take a look. That is next. This is Bloomberg. It was a rough start for Hewlett-Packard. Trading Wednesday morning, shares of HPE fell as much as 10%, the largest drop in 15 months. This despite what appeared to be solid second quarter earnings that saw HPE top estimates in earnings per share, revenue, and net income. It was also the fourth consecutive quarter in which HPE sales grew from the year before. So what caused Wall Street's bad reaction? To answer that, I want to bring in IDC's Chief Research Officer, Crawford Delpret. Crawford, what gives?
Hey, Emily, how are you? I think what you have here is a situation where, you have to keep in perspective that, there's been a long history with Hewlett-Packard and with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise in terms of, a lot of change. And I think that when Antonio Neri, the CEO, said that there was going to be, tougher compares going forward, I think that, probably there was a lot of concern about that, and that they were kind of, bracing for the second half. Now, having said that, this was a good quarter, and the company executed really, really well. And they are transforming the business. So, at IDC, we're not in the business of predicting the outcome or how markets are going to interpret this kind of stuff. But as an analyst, I will tell you, this company is executing really well. The compares are going to get more difficult going forward. But boy, I would take the HPE of today over the historical HPE, given net where they are. They're executing pretty well.
Interesting, given that, CEO Meg Whitman has moved on. They've got a new CEO in place. What should be at the top of his agenda, especially given that he's got some communication to do with investors?
Yeah, so that communication is going to be ongoing. And Antonio's relationship with, I think, the street is actually excellent. It's just they don't know kind of, how to interpret, that comment. And I think that if you look at the company, what they're doing is they're starting to enter the next phase. And that next phase is going to mean that, as you just said in your intro, they've had 4 quarters of consecutive growth. That means that the comparisons are going to get harder. And they operate in some very, very, very difficult businesses. They operate in low-end servers and high-end servers. They operate in storage. These are tough businesses. So they have to be able to drive margins from the most premium parts of those businesses, as well as from services from those businesses as well. And I think that they are doing that. So they're seeing higher margins in services. They're going after the higher margin parts of the server and storage business. They saw over 15% growth, or close to 15% growth, for Aruba, which is arguably one of the best acquisitions they've ever done. They're executing really, really well, and I think that they're just going to have to prove that execution as they get into this next phase.
Who are the competitors that HPE really needs to worry about?
So look, this is becoming a two-horse race very, very quickly for the broad base, and that's Dell. Dell EMC, and those two companies compete across a wide theater of products, whether it's storage, whether it's servers, whether it's other kinds of infrastructure. Now, they're on the periphery. There are some areas where Dell's invested in things like Pivotal, and there's areas in software where where HPE is invested most recently, and also in wireless. But really, that's the big competitor, and those are that's the at-scale competitor. Now, if you get a little bit more niche-y, you get into Lenovo, you get into NetApp. Obviously, IBM in the storage business. So there are other competitors, but really this wide range compute business is really becoming a two-horse race between those two companies. Obviously, Cisco in there for parts of the business as well, but Cisco more pure networking and other businesses they've invested in.
You know, we've talked a lot about how Dell, Michael Dell has always said bigger is better. Meg Whitman said smaller and leaner is better. Does either of their performances indicate which of those is true?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In the case of Dell, look, they are playing the scale game, and they're going to play the efficiency game as they right-size and reduce overlap within the EMC universe of products. So for them, that playbook is going to work really, really well. For HPI, which is the PC and printer company, and E for the enterprise company, that separation, as from this analyst, needed to happen. It needed to happen because they weren't able to really be able to focus in on what those businesses needed in order to show growth and show new kinds of innovation. And you're seeing that at HPI. And I think what's really interesting, and frankly was missed by Wall Street this quarter, is that the strategy that Antonio and his team are putting in place for HPE is really starting to take shape. And that is a pretty nimble strategy focused on software that differentiates and adds value to their systems, as well as being able to participate in a world that is multi-cloud and that is hybrid. And that's why they launched products like OneSphere and are now seeing uptake. That's why they launched products like Synergy to allow for a really dynamic private cloud composable infrastructure product. You're going to see that them trying to differentiate with services and new ways to consume services and add value to software all across infrastructure, that will be the strategy. That's how they'll generate higher margins. It's never going to be a super, super high margin business, but I think it can improve given the acquisitions from where they are today. So I think for HP, that split strategy allowed them to shine a focus on those two specific businesses.
Crawford Del Pret, Chief Research Officer at IDC. Thank you, as always, for joining
Thanks.
us. Coming up, our exclusive interview with Airbnb's biggest competitor in China. We're going to hear from Tu Jia, CFO, from the Goldman Sachs TechNet conference in Hong Kong. This is Bloomberg. Goldman Sachs annual TechNet conference is underway in Hong Kong. Bloomberg's Stephen Engel spoke exclusively to some of the region's leading and emerging tech players, including Tu Jia's CFO, Warren Wang. Tu Jia is known as China's Airbnb and is chasing the rapidly growing number of Chinese traveling to popular destinations outside the country, like Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, and more. We asked about the difference between the two home-sharing companies. Take a listen.
Airbnb is a well-respected competitor in China as well, but we think we are the #1 player in this industry in China. That's one thing. And the other thing is we are not just a pure online company. We have offline operations as well. So we have a local team in most cities in China to help these local house owners to run their business. That's, I think, the big difference between us and Airbnb in China.
Well, Silicon Valley could look to Seattle for a playbook on taxing big tech. Washington State's largest city last week levied a $50 million annual tax on big companies to help offset its homeless problem. San Francisco, Mountain View, East Palo Alto, and Cupertino are all considering similar taxes on large local employers to solve growing inequality and overcrowding they blame on the same tech industry that transformed them into boomtowns. Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer joins us now with more details. So how would this work, Eric?
There are different versions. A lot of them, take Mountain View. It would be $250 or $300 per employee that companies would pay to the city. Mountain View wants to raise something like $10 million. You could imagine about half of that would probably come from Google, their largest employer.
So why now, and how will they use the money?
Yeah, I think why now is what's super interesting here. I mean, the Trump tax cuts took effect. So these cities are watching the companies get back a lot of money from the federal government. So I think that's one. And then, these are sort of liberal cities with endemic housing, homelessness, and transportation problems that I think are fed up and deciding that they need to go where the money is, and that's clearly with the companies in their hometowns.
How far out could these new taxes be?
Well, I think it's imminent. Mountain View, it seems like it could be on the ballot in November. Even Cupertino, Apple's hometown, is thinking about a tax. Though, throughout all of this, there's always a discussion of a public-private partnership. If the companies come forward and say, we'll just give you some money to do this if you don't sort of entrench it in the law, that could always divert one of these taxes. But those are the conversations that are happening right now.
One last quick question for you, Eric. Uber is reportedly officially shutting down its self-driving program in Arizona. This, of course, after an accident that killed someone. What's the status of their self-driving program going forward?
Well, they've been sort of halted nationally, but the Arizona governor came out sort of very strong after the fatality, and so Uber is totally shutting down operations there with no hope of going back, and says that it's going to focus on Pittsburgh, and that's where their autonomous research is being done in the first place. And so I think there are some advantages there to keeping the testing close to the engineers who can react when there are problems and help sort of keep improving the autonomous vehicles.
All right, our Bloomberg Tech reporter Eric Newcomer there. Thank you so much for that update.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. From Washington, I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.